The Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the current state of United States policy towards Ethiopia. The Chair would also remind our guests today that peaceful protest is welcome in this House. However, violence or verbal outbursts will not be tolerated, as they are violations of House rules. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. A little over 1 year ago, there was widespread attention on the situation in Ethiopia. A cessation of hostilities agreement was reached between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, bringing an end to the intense conflict. This hearing serves to examine the status of cessation of hostilities agreement implementation and, more broadly, the U.S.-Ethiopia bilateral relationship. A stable Ethiopia is good for the Horn of Africa and important to broader strategic U.S. interests in the region. However, I'm very concerned about Ethiopia's current trajectory and the direction of our policy. The high expectations that began in 2019, including awarding a Nobel Peace Prize to expand and deepen bilateral relationship with Ethiopia, can still be met. But recent challenges by leadership in Ethiopia and challenges including greater conflict in the region and global economic shocks have clouded Ethiopia's journey. In particular, the war in Tigray, current conflicts in Amhara and Oromia, direct comments regarding Ethiopia's so-called existential right to port access, and an increasing posture away from the United States has eroded some of the optimism in Ethiopia's democratic future and raised fundamental questions about Ethiopia's economic and long-term political stability. These conflicts and their aftershocks have exposed the deep divisions present in Ethiopian society. Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki continues to undermine the cessation of hostilities agreement as his troops remain in Ethiopia, troops that have committed massacres, rapes, and other human rights violations and atrocities. Meanwhile, countries like China and the United Arab Emirates have established extensive economic ties with Ethiopia, ties that increasingly are moving into political and security space. Reports widely indicate that weapon systems provided by the UAE, among others, were a decisive factor in the Tigray conflict, and appears that Ethiopia is leading an increasingly rapid regional arms race. Additionally, just 3 months ago, the government of Ethiopia accepted an invitation into the BRICS country grouping. Economically, Ethiopia is struggling with unchecked inflation, a severe foreign currency shortage, and a sinking credit rating. Without support from international financial institutions, it's expected that Ethiopia is at risk of defaulting on its nearly $30 billion of external debt. In this, and seemingly only this, Ethiopia looks west for our money and is relying on International Monetary Fund staff-level agreement to stabilize its economy. The American taxpayers are tired of being used, and we hope to have some of our questions answered here today. Beyond the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which represents a critical piece of infrastructure for Ethiopia to reach its developmental goals, it's really hard to see other areas of optimism. The United States has had to suspend life-saving humanitarian assistance for 5 months this year because the government of Ethiopia's complicity in a food aid diversion sham. Last week, negotiations with the Oromo Liberation Army once again did not conclude with an agreement, while the conflict in Amhara has not even reached the negotiating table and still simmers. Implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement in Tigray remains incomplete, and no justice has been served for those brutalized by what some have called the deadliest conflict in the 21st century so far. Last December, just 1 month after the cessation of hostility agreement was signed and 11 months after Ethiopia's AGOA eligibility was rescinded for gross violations of human rights, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was invited to Washington, D.C. to attend the Africa Leaders Summit. The hearing title is about the promise and the peril of U.S. policy toward Ethiopia. And if I'm being honest, it's increasingly difficult to see where the promise lies. I thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimony. The Chair now recognizes the Ranking Member for a statement.
Thank you, Chair James and Ambassador Hammer, Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman. Thank you so much for testifying before the subcommittee today on the state of U.S. policy towards Ethiopia. Ambassador Hammer, it's great to see you again after welcoming you in San Diego this summer to host the Ethiopian Diaspora Peace Conference and hear the perspectives of different Ethiopian diaspora communities so we can work together towards peace for the country and region. I have to admit, I wish we were in San Diego right now. I am cold, but I'm glad to see you again to further that conversation. I'm so proud to represent San Diego, a community that has a long history of welcoming migrants and refugees, including Ethiopians, with open arms. And San Diego is just a small portion of the United States' strong Ethiopian diaspora, which encompasses hundreds of thousands of immigrants who have close familial, social, and economic ties to Ethiopia, and makes up the second largest African immigrant group in the United States. This hearing is very timely. It has been over 1 year since the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement in Pretoria between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, but we have continued to see ongoing human rights violations in Tigray and across the country, as well as spreading conflict in Amhara, Afar, and Oromia. The war in northern Ethiopia and ongoing conflict have triggered a massive refugee and displacement crisis, even setting a world record for displacements in a single year. We've also seen the disruption of crops and increase in food prices, causing millions in the country to rely on food aid, which was temporarily paused due to its diversion. I'm incredibly relieved that food assistance resumed earlier this month, and I commend USAID's work in securing important reforms to prevent diversion and ensure food reaches those in need. But it was clear when I traveled to Ethiopia in 2021, and it's even more clear today. Many challenges remain to create long-lasting peace, safety, and security. Following the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, the focus must now be on implementing the rest of the agreement in a thoughtful way, pursuing a credible and inclusive transitional justice process that guarantees accountability for war crimes and ongoing human rights violations, and addressing long-held grievances across the country through an inclusive and transparent national dialogue process to prevent another large-scale war. The United States must also urge all parties to pursue peace processes to address ongoing conflict in Amhara and Oromia. Addressing these root causes from a long-term conflict prevention perspective should be central to U.S. policy toward Ethiopia. And this will require high-level attention and prioritization from the United States and the international community, including cooperation from key regional actors with broad influence like the UAE and Turkey. Ethiopia represents the future of the African continent and is the second most populous African country. It has the potential to be a stabilizing force for the region and across the continent. But as it experiences high inflation and economic stressors since the war, it is now more important than ever to invest in Ethiopia's long-term stability, which must include real accountability and reconciliation among Ethiopians. It's a key national security priority for the United States to keep its attention on Ethiopia and do everything we can to help secure a more promising future for Ethiopians. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you all about prospects for long-term peace and stability and how the United States can be best positioned to support Ethiopians in this pursuit, which will be critical for the region and the broader continent. Thank you. I go back.
Thank you very much. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And echoing my ranking member's sentiments, I'm very, very pleased to have you here today. The Honorable Mike Hammer is Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, Bureau of African Affairs, U.S. Department of State. Tyler Beckelman is Deputy Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Africa, U.S. Agency for International Development. I thank you again each for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to please keep your spoken remarks to about 5 minutes, in order to allow for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Hammer for his opening statement. Good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs. It is a pleasure to see you both again. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss U.S. policy and interest in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa with you and the distinguished members of the subcommittee, as well as other members who have come here today because of their interest in Ethiopia. And I also want to recognize the Ethiopian diaspora, which is extremely active and which, of course, cares very deeply about events in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, as you have said, Mr. Chairman, is a strategically important country. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to working to promote peace, democracy, and economic development for the benefit of all Ethiopians, the broader region, as well as the American people. Our long-term goal is to support policies and reforms that will enable greater partnership between our two countries. During my tenure as Special Envoy, the administration has focused on bringing an end to conflicts in Ethiopia and reducing tensions around the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, otherwise known as GERD. Following the November 2022 Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, the COHA, between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, we have been focused on the agreement's implementation while impressing upon the Ethiopian government the importance of dialogue and negotiation as a path to resolving ongoing violence in Oromia and Amhara. And we regularly engage with the Ethiopian diaspora to explain U.S. policy, encourage civil discourse, and foster reconciliation among all ethnicities and regions. As we pursue these policies with our colleagues at USAID and the interagency, we absolutely prioritize our responsibility to U.S. taxpayers. In Pretoria, I was proud to represent the United States as an active observer in the African Union facilitated talks that led to the COHA. Within 48 hours of the signing of the COHA, it silenced the guns and ended a horrific two-year war that killed hundreds of thousands and caused untold suffering, including from horrific mass sexual and gender-based violence. Since its signing, the United States has supported efforts to implement all aspects of the COHA, among them transitional justice, accountability, protection of civilians, and respect for human rights, including by funding of international human rights observers. As Secretary Blinken said during his visit this last March, to avoid future conflicts arising from past grievances, it is important, essential, to account for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other human rights abuses and violations committed in the context of Ethiopia's conflicts. Shortly after his visit, the Secretary announced his determination that all sides had committed horrific atrocities in the northern conflict and that ensuring accountability will be a key element of our policy towards Ethiopia. As part of our commitment to accountability, the State Department has supported the work of the Transitional Justice Working Group of Experts, an independent body with a nationwide mandate. This working group held 60 consultations throughout Ethiopia to gather views from affected communities on the desire for justice, truth, reparations, and institutional reform. We look forward to the working group's recommendations, and we will work with the Ethiopian government, civil society, and the victims, including survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence on their implementation on the implementation of their recommendations. Over the last year, we have seen significant progress. For example, independent monitors have reported a dramatic decrease in human rights violations and abuses in Tigray. However, much more needs to be done. Eritrean forces have not fully withdrawn from Ethiopia. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, of the Tigrayan forces is lagging, and the status of contested areas remains unresolved. Therefore, implementation of the COHA remains a work in progress. And we are deeply concerned about the ongoing violence in Amhara and Oromia. There have been credible reports of gross violations of human rights, significant loss of life, and severe economic disruption. We have urged all actors to refrain from violence and hate speech and to protect civilians, and we have offered to support or participate in mediation efforts. In fact, I returned this last week from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where the U.S. participated in talks between the Ethiopian government and the Oromo Liberation Army. We reiterated to all involved that there are no military solutions to the complex challenges posed by these situations. Compounding these challenges, Ethiopia is also confronting macroeconomic stresses. Foreign exchange reserves are at the lowest in 2 decades. Inflation has averaged over around 30% for the last 2 years. So the IMF is in discussions with the government of Ethiopia over concerns about the state of the economy. Regarding the GERD, we are encouraged that there are diplomatic negotiations underway between the parties, and the United States remains actively diplomatically engaged to support those parties in achieving an agreement that benefits Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, as well as the region writ large. In closing, let me reiterate my appreciation to this committee for your commitment and counsel. Rest assured that we are clear-eyed about the challenges in Ethiopia as we work to support an Ethiopia that is more peaceful and prosperous, one in which the United States and Ethiopia can benefit from a strong partnership. Thank you, and I look forward to your insights, recommendations, and to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. I now recognize Mr. Beckelman for his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your committee's support for USAID and for the people of Ethiopia. USAID's long-standing development partnership with Ethiopia has helped propel historic improvements in living conditions for millions of Ethiopians, and we remain the largest bilateral donor of assistance to the Ethiopian people. Yet these gains have been compromised by the 2-year war in northern Ethiopia and insecurity in other parts of the country. The cessation of hostilities agreement between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front brought a much-needed reprieve to the millions of people affected by that terrible war. Yet many of the most critical commitments in this agreement have yet to be fully realized. It is imperative, as you note, as both of you noted, for Ethiopia to reckon with its past and commit to dialogue to prevent future conflicts. USAID will continue to stand with all Ethiopians wishing to live in dignity, peace, and prosperity. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR, is one of the most important elements of the COHA. As we see all over the world, DDR requires sustained political will and strong international commitment and financing. USAID plans to focus on the R in DDR, promoting reintegration, resilience, and early recovery for conflict-affected communities, particularly survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. We also plan to support intercommunal dialogue and revitalizing livelihood opportunities that will give demobilized soldiers productive pathways in civilian life. As the ambassador noted, one of the most important provisions in the COHA was the government of Ethiopia's commitment to a comprehensive national transitional justice policy. The government undertook broad public consultations to develop its framework, but has not yet begun implementation. We agree wholeheartedly that it is important to get this right. USAID stands ready to support the implementation of a transparent, victim-centered process that contributes to truth and reconciliation. It's also critical that Ethiopians themselves lead the fight for justice and accountability, which is why USAID supports local civil society organizations that monitor and advocate for these principles. We will continue to support both the National Human Rights Institution and international human rights monitors. USAID plans to increase assistance to local human rights actors and organizations to respond to crisis-related human rights violations and address other ongoing human rights issues. Beyond Tigray, we are of course troubled by the violence and abuses in other parts of the country, including Amhara and Oromia. USAID is supporting locally led initiatives in these locations to de-escalate tensions and will continue to emphasize that the peaceful resolution of conflicts through negotiation and dialogue pays off. Ultimately, Ethiopia's prospects for long-term stability and its tremendous economic potential hinge on whether the country is able to resolve grievances through dialogue and politics rather than violence and suppression. USAID is tracking the national dialogue process closely. It stands ready to support an inclusive, transparent, and broadly accepted process that helps reinforce long-term peace and stability. USAID continues to support civil society and other stakeholders so they can meaningfully engage in this process. And we will continue to consider support to the Dialogue Commission as it facilitates community consultations. Let me briefly turn to a critical issue, which you both alluded to, which is the diversions of humanitarian food aid. In the spring of 2023, USAID identified a coordinated food aid diversion scheme that prompted us to make the very difficult decision to pause food assistance to Ethiopia. This pause was a measure of last resort due to the extreme scale and scope of the diversion that we uncovered. Earlier this month, after the government of Ethiopia agreed to major changes in the food aid distribution system, USAID decided to resume food assistance to vulnerable groups across the country. Key elements of the reforms included ensuring the independent and verifiable management of the entire food aid supply chain and agreements on ensuring full access to warehouse, mills, and distribution sites for regular monitoring and oversight. The government also agreed to the internationally accepted best practice of vulnerability-based targeting with joint identification of beneficiaries and joint approval of beneficiary lists. USAID and the government of Ethiopia will implement a one-year trial period of this process that will be informed by periodic reviews and backed by continuous monitoring and evaluation by our team, our partners, and independent monitors. We are confident that the agreed reforms will reinforce the integrity of the food aid system and help ensure that critical assistance reaches the most vulnerable. We will not hesitate to pause activities again, however, if we continue to see evidence of diversion. So in closing, while we recognize the challenges ahead, USAID remains a committed partner in helping all Ethiopians live in peace, dignity, and prosperity. Thank you for your support of USAID's work in Ethiopia and for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening remarks. I now recognize myself for as much time as I may consume. In October 2023, Abiy publicly argued that Ethiopia landlocked since Eritrea seceded in '93 must acquire a port on the Red Sea to break its population out of a geographic prison, describing it as an existential issue. Further discussion around reopening direct Red Sea access, arguing that his request was based upon historical, geographical, ethnic, economic grounds, indicating that lack of access was a potential source of future conflict. Historical, geographical, ethnic, economic grounds. Does that sound familiar? Russia cultivated closer ties with Ethiopia during the Tigray conflict, which overlapped with its invasion of Ukraine. The more I learn about this, the more I'm growing concerned that the Ethiopian government is not interested in peace and is only interested in the West, the United States in particular, to solve its increasing financial woes. Can you help me parse through this? Number one question, gentlemen, whomever would like to answer first. When I hear a potential source of future conflict, is that a threat from the Ethiopian government?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have seen that the comments relating to port access have created concerns, not only for the United States, but also for other countries in the region. But I would also note that the Prime Minister has publicly said that efforts to gain access to a port will be done through commercial, peaceful means. And he has done his bit to provide public and private reassurances. Certainly, the last thing this region needs is another war. And we have been clear that from the perspective of the United States, what needs to happen both in the region and, but most importantly, internally inside Ethiopia, is to address conflicts and violence through peaceful dialogue. And we have demonstrated both through our work with the African Union in achieving the comprehensive, the AGOA, as well as the cessation of hostilities agreement, as well as participating more recently in the talks on the OLA, that is our commitment, so that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hammer, excuse the interruption. You just acknowledged also credible reports of gross violations of human rights in Amhara and Oromia. Does the department consider this, in addition to the past statements, regardless of how it may have been softened for Western ears? Does this constitute a pattern, and how much should we believe folks who are following in the footsteps of essentially Russia joining and aligning with BRICS?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we are deeply concerned and alarmed by the reports of extrajudicial killings, detentions that are and suffering that is being inflicted upon civilians in both Amhara and Oromia. We have made this clear to the government, Secretary Blinken, in numerous calls with the Prime Minister, as well as officials at all levels of the State Department.
Have we made it clear that concrete steps must be taken in the immediate future to rectify this, and are you satisfied with the progress they're making, sir?
Yes, sir. We have always in our conversations made clear that human rights is a core component of the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy, and that it matters in terms of how we view our bilateral relationship with Ethiopia. So we are continuously pressing for improvement. We are not satisfied, and those conversations will continue every day as needed until hopefully we see a cessation of all violations and abuses taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. Mr. Beckelman, if you have a comment, next 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, just very quickly, that we believe very firmly that it's in our interest, it's in the Ethiopian people's interest, and it's in the world's interest to prevent an economic collapse in Ethiopia and to see the Ethiopian people stand on their 2 feet. That's why we continue to support these processes and continue to support them in a way that we feel is consistent with our values and our interests in Ethiopia. and we'll continue to do that. With a population of 126 million people, over 40% of which are youth under the age of 15, we think it's absolutely incredible to continue to help Ethiopians stand on their 2 feet, and a stable and democratizing Ethiopia is ultimately in the best interest of the United States.
Totally agree with all this monkeying around. The Ethiopian people are the ones who truly suffer. I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Ms. Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In September, I led a letter to Secretary Blinken and Ambassador Thomas Greenfield urging the United States to use its voice and influence to renew the mandate of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, ICRI. Unfortunately, ICRI's mandate was not renewed, ending the only independent investigative mechanism with the mandate to investigate abuses across all of Ethiopia. Ambassador Hammer, what specific steps did the U.S. government take in advocating for ICRI's renewal, and what plan is in place to ensure independent human rights monitoring continues?
Ranking Member, I appreciate and remember receiving your letter and appreciate your deep interest in continuing the ICRI mission, which we thought absolutely was critical and important. We worked to try to renew it in Geneva. Unfortunately, it was not renewed. However, in anticipating that perhaps there wouldn't be the support for its renewal, we, the United States, through our colleagues in USAID, provided funding for OHCHR monitors to be deployed in Tigray and other regions of Ethiopia. In fact, I've met with those monitors on my visits to Mekele this past year, and they have reported a dramatic decrease in human rights violations. So we are committed to ensuring that there is independent monitoring and that there is certainly investigations into past abuses and atrocities and war crimes that have been committed.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. On that note, according to a recent Harvard survey, more than 90% of Ethiopians believe it would be unacceptable to move forward without some sort of truth-seeking trials or reparations. But I think all of us who've worked in conflict know that transitional justice, how you do it is more complicated than it sounds. And the survey also found that residents of Tigray have little confidence in domestic courts to provide justice, but that a plurality of Ethiopians across the country favored using existing domestic courts to pursue accountability as opposed to some sort of hybrid or international mechanism. And obviously, like everything in Ethiopia, it varied widely among regions. So navigating a credible transitional justice process will be challenging but incredibly important. Ambassador Hammer, how does the United States intend to work with the government of Ethiopia to address structural challenges and political will to pursue an inclusive, transparent, and credible process that is conflict sensitive?
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs. As I mentioned, when Secretary Blinken visited in March, he had direct conversations with the Prime Minister and senior members of his cabinet, as well as making public the United States' absolute commitment to seeing through what both the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF have committed to in terms of ensuring that there's transitional justice. But transitional justice, as you said, has to also be a national process. And in fact, our Office of Global Criminal Justice, Ambassador Beth Van Schok and her team have been very thoroughly engaged in Ethiopia. I was there during one of her visits. And recently, when I was in Addis last week, met with the Minister of Justice, Gideon, to find out what's the status of their policy process. And he said that their white paper is coming soon. But we absolutely agree with you that it needs to be credible, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to take into account the victims. And as you said, it is a very complicated process, but we as the United States are also, with other countries, are prepared to support this process, to support the government if it is in fact credible and inclusive. And ultimately, it'll be the Ethiopian people that will be there to judge whether it is achieving the desired result. But we all agree that to overcome the historic grievances that have plagued Ethiopia, there absolutely must be a transitional justice system that is responsive to the people, and there needs to be accountability for the gross violations of human rights that have occurred.
And has the Ethiopian government taken any steps yet to prosecute military officers who had command authority for units implicated in atrocities?
Ranking Member Jacobs, My understanding is that there are efforts underway to prosecute. I'm also advised by our experts that those prosecutions need to be transparent and shouldn't be rushed. But we can get you further information on any prosecutions that may have occurred, but we are expecting that they will happen.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ranking Member. I now recognize Rep. Kane for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today with us, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to follow up on some of the Chairman's line of questioning regarding, as Prime Minister Abe increasingly orients his foreign policy decisions eastwards and continues to ignore basic benchmarks on justice and transparency, what in the last 3 years has indicated that Abe cares about his reputation in Washington? And as a follow-up, in what regards has Prime Minister Abe followed through on any of the concessions or agreements made when he was here for the African Leaders Summit?
Thank you, Representative Kane. We have consistently had very direct and frank discussions with the Prime Minister as well as with his government on the expectations that the United States has for having a partnership that is beneficial to the American people and to Ethiopians. And as a part of that conversation, we have repeatedly urged that there be an improvement in the human rights situation. And again, at least as part of the COHA that was signed in November 2nd of 2022, we saw the government follow through on its commitments in allowing for an interim regional administration to be established in Tigray. We saw withdrawal of VNDF troops that has now led to a significant decrease in human rights abuses as recognized by independent monitors. And after months of urging, we have seen now an effort for dialogue with the Oromo Liberation Army, one in which we were invited as the United States, again, participated as an observer. So we believe that, again, U.S. engagement in order to promote stability, democracy in Ethiopia is essential to trying to put Ethiopia on the right path. And we will continue to pursue those efforts at every level, including when Prime Minister Abiy attended the African Leaders Summit and had discussions with both our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and Secretary Blinken.
So what was it that you saw when you were there as an observer status in the negotiations? What's the timeline for resolution to some of these conflicts and the fighting in your point of view?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the question. When I took this job in June of 2022, I was told that this horrific war in Tigray in northern Ethiopia would never end. That would be disastrous, and it had already been horrific. And yet, through quiet diplomacy and working with the African Union, we were able to achieve a very significant peace. Now we're involved in talks with between the government and the OLA. It would be, it would be difficult to say that we can yield the kind of result that we would like, everyone, the people of Oromia would like in short order. The talks were difficult. I spent 2.5 weeks in Dar es Salaam, but progress was made. But we are committed to trying to see a peaceful resolution to these conflicts, also in Amhara. If there is an opportunity, we will offer our good offices to help mediate, to help promote a peaceful dialogue. We have been clear repeatedly, there are no military solutions to these complex, difficult, historical issues in Ethiopia. And I'm proud that the administration has made every effort consistently to try to advance peace, and we are committed to continuing these efforts and whenever the opportunity arises.
If I may,
yes.
What do you think are the biggest limitations to negotiations succeeding?
Well, of course, it's not only just the government, but both parties need to be prepared to make compromises and, frankly, to have the courage to decide that violence is not the answer, that what is best for their interests and their people more broadly is to enter into a political dialogue that achieves some of their objectives. We have seen their efforts underway for a national dialogue, which we believe, if it is inclusive and credible, could be a very important step forward for overcoming some of these historic grievances and horrific and terrible ethnic tensions that are currently plaguing Ethiopia.
Thank you. My time has run out here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. The Chair now recognizes Rep. Sherfield McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, along with my colleagues, are obviously pleased that this month marks 1 year since the cessation of the hostility agreement was signed, bringing an end to the horrific 2-year war in Tigray. During that horrific conflict, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans were forcibly displaced from western Tigray during the war, in what the State Department determined constituted an ethnic cleansing. My question is a follow-up to Rep. Jacobs. Is there any way the U.S. can assist Ethiopian authorities in prosecuting those responsible for crimes in western Tigray?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We appreciate your interest and concern. We share the same concern that those responsible for these war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross violations of human rights be held accountable. We are prepared, of course, to cooperate. It is currently the responsibility of both the government of Ethiopia and, in fact, the government of Eritrea, whose forces were also responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, to prosecute the individuals responsible, and we will continue to insist that they do.
My second question is, Ethiopia has historically been a major contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. It currently has 1,500 troops serving the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Now, my question for Ambassador is, how is the UN ensuring, through enhanced vetting, that the Ethiopian troops who committed gross human rights violations during the war are not serving in the UN peacekeeping missions?
That's a good question, and in fact, we demand through Lehi vetting in terms of, any security cooperation that we might be involved in. And the UN, as you have indicated, has its own vetting procedures, which are absolutely necessary, again, as you said, to ensure that any troops or individuals who have been involved in human rights violations not participate in any UN peacekeeping mission.
And could you shed some light on some of the new vetting processes and practices?
The UN's, I would have to defer to their processes. Again, it's important that they are in place in terms of the thoroughness. I'm proud of the Lehi vetting that we do as the United States, and I would hope that they are equally thorough.
In late 2021, when the United States terminated Ethiopia's eligibility for AGOA benefits, the Biden administration provided the Ethiopian government with a set of benchmarks, many of which focused on the Tigray conflict, in order to regain its AGOA status. Ambassador Hammer, what is the administration's current assessment of Ethiopia's compliance with those benchmarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, you're right. We provided some benchmarks, as you may know. The eligibility to AGOA is currently under review and will be determined in a matter of weeks. But as the chairman and the ranking member, if all of you have said, there are grave concerns about continuing human rights violations in Ethiopia, specifically in Amhara and Oromia, and not to get in front of what will be decided by USTR and the White House, but those human rights concerns need to be addressed under the legal standards of AGOA.
And from your professional assessment of the eligibility requirements, what do you think about them?
Well, as a member of the administration, I don't have any personal thoughts. Yeah, no, professional. I mean, of course. I mean, Congress passed AGOA and set some very clear and stringent guidelines that must be abided by. And therefore, that's what the administration does. We analyze the situation on the ground and see if, in fact, eligibility is available. And we constantly evaluate the situation. AGOA is beneficial to the United States, as well as, obviously, to the country that's seeking it. But there are certain standards that must be adhered to.
And with the information you have right now, do you believe that they'll meet the eligibility requirements?
Again, it's not just my decision alone. This is a very thorough interagency process led by our USTR. And I think that given what we've been discussing here at this hearing, it's fair to say that there are very serious remaining concerns given the reports of human rights violations occurring currently in both Oromia and Amhara.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
You're welcome.
The chair now recognizes Rep. Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Special Envoy Hammer, I want to thank you and start by commending your efforts to reach an agreement to bring the intense conflict to an to be an end about a year ago. But it's clear that the terms of the agreement have not been fully implemented, and it looks like the timeline for a peaceful resolution of those disputes in line with the Constitution remains still unidentified or undefined. Many human rights groups and experts, including the Simon Saljot Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, have been critical of the transitional justice process being conducted by the Ethiopian government. However, despite this skepticism, the State Department appears to be giving credence to this government-run process. So I want to ask you, who is the senior-most individual in the government of Ethiopia or among the Tigrayan political establishment to be held accountable for the human rights violations?
Thank you, Representative Kim. The process is ongoing. I know that we are impatient in terms of wanting to see that justice be done and that individuals be held accountable. I can assure you again, at all levels of our government, with the Ethiopian government and those responsible for developing their transitional justice process and ensuring that there's accountability, that we continue to press to make sure that it is a process in terms of transitional justice that is inclusive and that will be
Special Envoy, does the Ethiopia's interministerial level task force still exist?
I believe it does. And again, there are internal Ethiopian processes underway. We provide advice and support to try to ensure, again, that it'll be a credible, inclusive transitional justice.
Does that task force have jurisdiction over the Ministry of Defense?
I believe it, well, I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, what benchmarks is the administration using to determine whether the Ethiopian government's proposed transitional justice policies are in line with the international standards, including being victim-centered?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It needs to be victim-centered, and I'm sure my colleague from USAID, Tyler, can provide even further guidance in terms of the support that we're doing there. The white paper enunciating the government's policy has not come out yet. There have been discussions in the lead-up to it. We have been providing advice. I attended one of the conferences with a group of international experts on transitional justice, where there were other experts from Africa, Europe, and Latin America. So I know that the government has been getting advice in terms of how it best should proceed in line with other international efforts that have produced credible, inclusive transitional justice
Can you tell
processes.
me who has the accountability over the Ministry of Defense?
Well, the government of Ethiopia is responsible ultimately, and they'll have to ensure that members of their forces who have been involved in gross violations of human rights are held accountable.
You know, Chinese economic activists, activities and investments throughout Africa have been directly linked to environmental degradation and have created public health emergencies throughout the continent. For example, in 2014, the Somali Ogaden region of Ethiopia has seen thousands die from a mysterious disease in areas surrounding a Chinese government-linked natural gas plant that has poisoned the drinking water supply. I want to ask the question to both of you. How does the State Department plan to hold China accountable for the negative impact of China's investment in African and local communities?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that
Yeah.
one, Congresswoman. Thank you very much for your question. I think the incidents that you cite are absolutely tragic. And we know across the board, you know, in Ethiopia that environmental degradation is a huge problem in many parts of the country, and it contributes to poverty and food insecurity. Our first response to this should be, and we would certainly encourage the government of Ethiopia to do its own investigation and to prosecute those companies that are responsible for harming their citizens, first and foremost, as a mechanism of responsibility. I would also say that just as USAID, we place the highest priority on ensuring that our investments are in line with world-class standards of environmental quality and sustainability. But I would really press the government of Ethiopia to fully investigate and to hold accountable those firms that are harming the Ethiopian people.
I think my time's up, but
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
thank you.
The chairman now recognizes Rep. Kamlager Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see you again, Mr. Hammer. I just want to say on the outset that I think the African community as a whole would like to see some consistency regarding our outrage to civilian deaths and human rights violations and the need for accountability. I'm not justifying any side of any conflict, but African countries often feel our double standard. I would also just like to thank you for elevating the underrated power of diplomacy. The last administration didn't understand that when it came to the continent. So I have a few questions. The first is, what do you think the impact of BRICS's recent expansion to include Ethiopia, and what should we be thinking about?
Thank you. It's good to see you again. I do have to report that my Trojan daughter, Brynja, graduated and is working in LA.
Great, right on.
Got to keep the Trojan connection. Well, on the BRICS, we as the administration see that the majority of countries want a stable and open and prosperous and secure world that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity and promotes shared responsibility and enables cooperation on shared challenges. We have no interest in dividing the world into rigid blocks. The United States will continue to work closely with our partners, including those that are members of BRICS. And so, yes, we've seen that Ethiopia is going to join the group. It's a motley of countries that don't seem to share much in common. So from the U.S. perspective, we want to, again, stand by our values, our market economy, the key components that have helped in development and have helped countries progress. And we remain, I think, a very attractive partner to countries around the world, including Ethiopia.
Thank you for that. I think they do share a skepticism for the West, and I asked the question because I do have concerns about Somalia and contentions around maritime routes. But I will go to my next question. I've been concerned to hear reports of escalating hostilities in Ethiopia, particularly in Amhara, between the Fano militias and the Ethiopian National Defense Force. So has the State Department been engaging with the government on ways to bring an end to this violence?
Yes, and in fact, we have. I was in Addis last week, met with the Prime Minister and some of his senior advisors, and we continue to impress upon them that we do not see a military solution to the conflict in Amhara, that we believe that the best way forward would be to start some type of dialogue. And of course, we have repeatedly urged all parties to refrain from hurting and inflicting horrific acts on civilians. So there's an absolute need to protect civilians, to stay away from ethnic hatred. And the United States is prepared, again, to offer our good offices, our diplomatic efforts to try to, again, bring some level of peace to that region so that those problems can be addressed through dialogue rather than conflict.
Great. Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman, I'd love to get your voice on the record. So recent studies suggest that more than 100,000 women may have been the victim of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray during the 2-year civil war. So what is the level of need of victims of this conflict-related sexual violence? And what has USAID, how have they been serving in this space?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Let me just say that the need is huge. The degree of sexual violence that attended this conflict was horrific and widespread. We have seen, it's very difficult to verify these reports, but we've seen upwards of the estimates of over 50% of the women in Tigray experience some form of sexual violence, a lot of times in a significant majority of those cases being rape. And other forms of really, really severe sexual violence.
All ages? Ages?
All ages. After the signing of the COHA, USAID made it a priority to surge support into organizations that were providing protection services to women, providing counseling services to women who were affected by this terrible conflict, providing psychosocial support to women who are affected by this conflict. We estimate that through USAID programs, we'll reach close to 100,000 survivors of SGBV with counseling services, with dignity kits. We are supporting a broad network of referrals in hospitals to be able to help women access these services, continue to get the treatment that we need. And we've seen an increase of approximately about 25% of sort of service availability to now over 68% just in the time since the COHA was signed due to USAID investments and the work of our implementing partners on the ground. We're going to continue to make this a priority for our investments, and we're going to continue to try and make sure that women who are affected get the services that they desperately need.
Thank you for that. Apologies for the time going over, Mr. Chair. I just want to say I think it is the frailty of men that cause them to harm women. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to a question that I don't believe was answered. Ambassador Hammer, if you could state for me clearly, you acknowledged credible reports of gross violations of human rights in Amhara and Oromia. Does the department consider that a pattern? Yes or no?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As of yet, we do not, but we are constantly reviewing the facts on the ground, and we know the implications of making such an assessment and determination in terms of whether it's a consistent pattern or pattern of gross violations of human rights.
Thank you. I now recognize Rep. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I represent a diverse district in Colorado with a vibrant Ethiopian diaspora community. For this community, these challenges that we're discussing today are tangible, lived reality. They have loved ones who have been affected by conflict, killed, displaced, and extreme economic stressors, by droughts and floods, and by ongoing challenges that have shaped and distorted their way of life over many years. I meet with these communities to hear about their concerns, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss a few of them today. So first, in signing the cessation of hostilities agreement, federal officials committed to restoring basic services and expediting aid. But I still hear from constituents about their inability to access basic necessities. To Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman, how has the U.S. pushed the Ethiopian government on the issue of addressing outstanding access issues in Tigray? And can you speak to the Ethiopian government, how they've taken steps to abide by the cessation agreement and make improvements? And also, similarly, along the same vein, I've heard a lot of concerns about human rights violations and civilian harm in Amhara as well, and a lot of issues there. So a state of emergency and other limitations have reduced access to the area and make it very difficult to understand what is occurring on the ground in real time. So to Ambassador Hammer, how is the United States monitoring reported violations and engaging with the Ethiopian government to pursue a peaceful resolution in the Amhara region as well?
Thank you, Congressman, very much for your question. Let me just say the access picture for humanitarian organizations, USAID partners, and others is still decidedly mixed. We saw after the COHA a tremendous increase in access to parts of Tigray that silenced the guns, and we took full advantage of those opportunities to surge our assistance and services into those locations. In other places, access continues to sort of track around the areas that are experiencing insecurity. So in parts of Amhara and Oromia now, it is still very difficult and very dangerous for humanitarians to work there. They continue to face persistent threats on the ground, and they continue to have to make day-to-day decisions about their security and their ability to deliver services in those locations. We continue to insist and continue to push for full access across the board for all of our implementing partners. But really, you know, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, and it still remains a very dangerous place for humanitarian service providers.
Ambassador?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your interest. I have engaged with Tigrayan diaspora in Denver directly, so I know of their passion and their concern for their loved ones in Tigray, as well as the diaspora writ large, some of the members who are here representing the Amhara community, and of course, Oromo and all the others. We, as the United States, care about all Ethiopians and certainly will denounce violations of human rights against any individual, irrespective of ethnicity. In terms of the situation in Amhara, we have had discussions and urged the government to lift the state of emergency, to allow access to media, to allow access to the internet, and to enable there to be clear ability to understand what the situation in Amhara currently is. We also have urged the government to find a way forward through dialogue and peaceful discussion to address some of the very difficult historic issues that affect people in Amhara and that are currently the reason for the fighting. We have been clear that there are no military solutions to this conflict, and we hope that, like the government has in the past, that perhaps the United States might be able to help resolve these issues by offering our good offices and our expertise in terms of trying to move forward in a way that ends the violence.
Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the outreach to the diaspora community as well. I mean, I represent all of those groups, Tigrays, Amaras, Oromos, and it's very clear that the only pathway to peace will be if all of those groups have the right to live in security and dignity and safety. And I will reiterate my request that the administration continue to push the government to make sure that that is the case, that is true, and that they are pushing, that we are pushing hard for peace and security for all Ethiopians. Thank you.
Rest assured that we are and we will continue.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Rep. Sherman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Thank you for allowing me to participate, although I'm not a member of the subcommittee. This conflict lasted 2 years. 500,000 people died. That's 40 times the number of deaths in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since October 7th. It is outrageous that this conflict has not gotten more attention in the world. That is not a problem caused by our witnesses here. They're working on it every day. We have a UN Secretary General who outrageously said that what's happening in Gaza is unparalleled. No, what's unparalleled is what happened in northern Ethiopia. We have a number of others in the human rights community who have very falsely said that what is happening in Gaza is massively larger than anything that has happened since 2019. No, it is what we're here to talk about today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. There's also a feeling that since we had the Pretoria Agreement in November of 2022, our job is done. I think this hearing has illustrated the fact that that is not the case. I know there's been discussion here about Ethiopia's desire for a seaport. Obviously, we don't change international boundaries almost ever. But I will point out, I believe that Bolivia has certain rights with regard to Chilean ports. There are a number of other circumstances where a landlocked country has the right to use a port and have access to it and to not have tariffs on goods going out or going in. And I would think it'd be a step toward peace if Eritrea would agree not to give up any of its territory, but also not to charge tariffs. Mr. Hamer, thank you so much for coming to my district and meeting with the diaspora there. Last November, I asked Assistant Secretary Fee if the United States would support additional sanctions on Eritrea if they fail to withdraw their troops from Ethiopia. And I asked us particularly sanctions on the president himself and on mining that goes on in Eritrea. She said yes. It's a year later, and Eritrean troops are still there. What's worse is that they are committing extrajudicial execution of civilians, sexual enslavement of women, and other terrible human rights abuses. So I'll ask you, why haven't we sanctioned Eritrea, its mining operations, and especially its president?
Thank you, Representative Sherman. Good to see you again. And I appreciate your passion, dedication, and concerns for all Ethiopians affected by horrific human rights violations. And as you've indicated, the job is not done. We continue to work on this every day. I appreciate your comments on access to a port, access to the sea. We discussed this earlier in the hearing, but it's interesting that you would mention Bolivia and Chile, as I have served in both Bolivia and been ambassador to Chile, and had a discussion with Prime Minister Abiy just last week on Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day, where I mentioned that they might want to look at that as an example. But the Prime Minister has clarified or made public remarks that, in fact, he's looking for a commercial, peaceful way to achieve that access, and so we will continue to encourage that. We can ill afford another war on the Horn. In terms of your specific question of sanctioning of Eritreans, we have sanctioned some. We have extended the executive order, and we continuously review whether we should sanction other individuals or organizations, so I'll take that back and see where we are on.
Especially with a commitment made by the Assistant Secretary that under those circumstances we would have sanctions on the president. It's time to act. It's been a year. What would be even better, of course, is if Eritrea withdrew its troops. There's absolutely no justification for their being there. Second, I understand that our food trucks will be getting in next month, that finally Abiy has relented and allowed us to have the control necessary to prevent massive theft. And I'll ask the witness from USAID, are we going to be sending enough in, not only to deal with those in refugee camps, but all the very hungry people in northern Ethiopia?
Thank you, Congressman Sherman. We're going to do our best on this.
Do we have sufficient funds and trucks and logistics to get the job done?
We have, we're confident in the logistics chain that we're doing it. We're confident in our partners' ability to deliver, and with the very generous support of Congress, we greatly appreciate. We think we're in a good place to continue to make a difference in the lives of the Ethiopians.
People are hungry.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I now recognize Ranking Member Jacobs for as much time as she may consume.
Thank you. I have so many more questions for you guys. The UAE and Turkey have both sent sizable arms shipments to and engaged in significant military cooperation with Ethiopia during the 2-year civil war. Given the significant relationship the United States has with these two countries and the seemingly few consequences these two countries have seemed to face for this involvement, did the U.S. government ever urge either government to cease its material support to Ethiopia during the war? What was the response? If not, why? How have we prioritized our policy objectives in Ethiopia with these two countries when we're dealing with them at the highest diplomatic levels?
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs. One of the first trips I made out to the region included a stop in Abu Dhabi, and I've had also separate discussions with Turkey officials, as have more senior members of our government, expressing concern about the provision of drones to the government of Ethiopia during the conflict. Rest assured, we raised those concerns. We made clear that it was only making matters worse. And fortunately, we were able to bring an end to that conflict through the COHA. But we did, in fact, during the conflict, make it clear that it was only fueling more suffering, and that we had hoped that they would desist.
And have they faced any repercussions for their involvement in the conflict vis-a-vis their relationship with us?
We have very broad and complex relationships with both of those countries, and I would defer to others who handle those relationships. But again, we have very frank and direct conversations with our partners, our allies, and others, making U.S. views very clearly known.
Thank you. So the humanitarian needs in Ethiopia remain high. We've talked about them a bit already. They continue to be triggered by the combined effects of climate events, conflicts, intercommunal violence, disease outbreaks. According to OCHA, only 33% of the funds required to address these needs have been met. Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman, what is the U.S. doing to urge the international community and key regional partners to scale up humanitarian assistance in Ethiopia and address challenges to humanitarian operations in the region?
Congresswoman, that's a fantastic question. We very much appreciate it. I think if you look globally, sadly, because of so many crises around the world, humanitarian needs are going up everywhere. And so we continue to recognize USAID is by far the largest donor in Ethiopia, but we cannot do it alone. And we continue to emphasize to all of our partners in regular donor dialogues on the ground in Ethiopia with our mission in Addis and in other places the need for others to step in and to help. We're also very focused on ensuring that we're not just providing relief and assistance, but we're helping people recover and stand on their own and graduate from humanitarian assistance and be able to provide for themselves. That's why, with the very generous support of Congress through previous supplementals, we've also invested heavily in resilience and recovery activities that we hope will make a difference in helping reduce long-term needs in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. And then my last question, because I know some of my colleagues have some more questions for you as well. One of the key grievances that needs to be addressed in Ethiopia is corruption, including at the regional state level. We've been hearing from various diaspora communities about their concerns on this issue in particular. So if both of you could talk to what we're doing to support anti-corruption efforts across the country, including not just at the national level, but also within regional governments.
Thank you again. Great question. I think as I mentioned in my opening statement, one of the key elements of our support is to support and empower Ethiopians who are leading the charge on addressing those issues. So we continue to expand and look to continue to partner with support to local civil society organizations throughout Ethiopia who are playing an absolutely critical role in exposing corruption and providing that sort of popular check on those types of abuses. And we're proud to continue that support and as one of the key elements of our program and portfolio there.
Yeah, I would just add that give great credit to my colleagues in USAID that uncovered this massive aid diversion, denying the people who needed much needed food assistance. And that's part of the effort of fighting corruption. In fact, we're using that to demonstrate to the government that it needs to do more, and that we are prepared, of course, to fight corruption and to support efforts. But again, USAID's work in this field has been tremendous, and we will continue to expand it. I'm sure there are programs that our colleagues in the INL Bureau are also involved in to support anti-corruption efforts.
That's great. And, I think sometimes we forget that anti-corruption is both a programmatic focus, but needs to be addressed at a diplomatic level as well. So I appreciate you all working together. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ranking Member. I now recognize Rep. Sherman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Beckelman. Returning to The aid situation, I'd point out that AP has reported that possibly thousands of people have starved to death in Tigray since we suspended aid. On the other hand, the diversions there were not only harmful to the people in Ethiopia, but if we ignore diversions, that will be harmful to aid elsewhere in the world. So I understand what you've done up until now. Some reporting suggests that USAID is only restoring aid to those who are refugees in Ethiopia. Can you clarify that we'll be providing food to other and medicine to other needy people in northern Ethiopia?
I can, Congressman. Thank you for that question. We did announce that we have resumed after we reached agreement with the government of Ethiopia on the implementation of reforms, that we would resume food assistance deliveries to the entire country, including conflict-affected IDPs in northern Ethiopia. I would also just note that a lot of focus has been placed on the pause in food aid, but throughout, the period of that pause, food aid is just one component of the overall sort of suite of humanitarian activities that we provide to the people, that we help provide to the people of Ethiopia in things like, supplementary and nutritional feeding for malnourished children and children under 5 continued throughout the period of pause.
Thank you. Looking at the internally displaced persons, 1.8 million have been displaced. They've been ethnically cleansed from western Tigray by Amhara forces. The question is, what will we do to accomplish 2 goals? First, to let people go back to their homes, and then second, to make sure that we resolve the issue of western Tigray. The Pretoria Agreement says that that's supposed to be according to constitutional means. Constitution seems to say you go with a referendum, but nothing's more phony than a referendum after an ethnic cleansing. So Ambassador, what can we do with AGOA and the IMF to press Ethiopia to allow Tigrayans to return to western Tigray, and to make sure that a resolution occurs that isn't a phony referendum?
Thank you very much for the question. As you probably know, I have visited Mekele, I've visited an IDP camp, and I've seen the horrific circumstances under which those Tigrayans are living, and their urgent need to return back to their homes. As you accurately pointed out, in the cessation hostilities agreement, it is meant that the disputed areas be resolved within the Constitution, as well as through political dialogue, and that is ongoing. We're all impatient. We all recognize the urgent need for internally displaced people to be able to return to their homes and live in security. We are continuously assured that security will come to western Tigray.
If I can interrupt,
Yeah.
We've had all these people displaced from western Tigray. Have other people from outside western Tigray moved in, or is land lying fallow? What is happening in western Tigray?
Unfortunately, it's difficult for us to know exactly what is happening because of the security situation. There are no impediments from the government for us to travel into Walkite/Western Tigray, but given the security situation, it is extremely dangerous, and we have to be very careful about deploying our personnel from the embassy, from USAID, into that area. So we don't have perfect clarity, so I don't want to misspeak. But again, what we're very much focused on is making sure that internally displaced people, wherever they might be, are able to return to their homes as soon as possible.
If the Ethiopian government on this issue and other important issues doesn't adhere to the Pretoria Agreement, our biggest pressure point is to prevent IMF lending to Ethiopia. Are we prepared to do that, and do we have the clout inside the IMF to do it? Not with the goal of permanently preventing the IMF lending, but with the goal of getting Ethiopia to adhere to the agreement.
I appreciate the question, and frankly, our engagement with the IMF is very much focused on trying to ensure that there's not a collapse of the Ethiopian economy, which would certainly not be in America's interest and the Ethiopian people's interest. and the engagement of the IMF, and I'll defer, of course, to my Treasury colleagues, is important to try to bring about economic reforms, privatization that will help all Ethiopians.
I would hope that in addition to those reforms, that a resolution on Western Tigray and the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement is at the very highest level, that major IMF loans are not approved until we get Ethiopia on the right track there. And we're dealing with a government that interrupted USAID, first allowed the theft, and then second interrupted the aid by not allowing us until, I guess, next month to have the kind of controls that we have elsewhere in the world. So this is a government that needs your pressure, and I'm sure you'll do it. It's a difficult job. I'm glad we have you there doing it.
With that, I can agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, we're going to conclude, and we conclude with my thanks and gratitude from this subcommittee. Your valuable testimony and the members, I'm grateful for your questions, very insightful. The members of this committee will have some additional questions which may be given to the witnesses later on, and you can respond to them in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.